Greetings to all of you and welcome to this CEO conversation with Richard Edelman, the Chief Executive of the global communications powerhouse Edelman. It's the largest public relations firm in the world by revenue. He also happens to be one of the foremost authorities on trust in business, government, media, NGOs, but we'll get back to that in a moment. I'm Fred Kempe. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. Richard and I have known each other for a long time, from my days as a correspondent and then an editor of the Wall Street Journal and the Wall Street Journal Europe. We've competed on tennis courts, hiking trails, bicycle paths, and also on basketball courts. I've never won. I come to this interaction with a little bit of modesty. Richard, before we get into the details of your Trust Barometer, your latest release of the Trust Barometer, and some of the groundbreaking findings from that barometer in our age of COVID-19. So since you launched your 2000 Trust Barometer in Davos, and I was there to witness that as well, this last January, and Richard, it seems like a decade ago now, there has been a seismic shift in what you call the trust landscape. I wonder if you can walk us through your new survey and its findings, and for me, some counter-intuitional findings regarding governments in the way I read it.
So we've been following trust for 20 years, and in the long stroke, you see that government actually peaked in 2008, started to fall in 2011 with the impasse on Greek debt, and then issues in DC between Democrats and Republicans, which continues, and then into developing market scandals. NGOs have always been the highest trusted institution, somehow the objective good guys. Media is like an airplane running out of fuel. It's starting to just sort of decline, in part dragged down by social media. And business is up and down, depending on economic cycles, scandals, etc. So in Davos, in January, we said for the first time, business is the most trusted institution in the world. Private sector stepping into the void left by government, able, doing sustainability, leading on many fronts. And now there's just a stunning reversal in the last 4 months. Government has become the most trusted institution in the world. And that's a universal phenomenon across 11 countries. We polled 13,000 people, we polled elites, mass audience, etc. And fascinating, the extent of the rise of government is actually indicated by the permissions that it's been granted. So 75% of people, government has the right to tell us when to lock down. 2/3 of people, government has access to our digital phone records, no problem, as long as it cures COVID. This is a level of permission we really haven't ever seen. And it reminds me sort of World War II, where somehow government to the rescue, meatless Mondays, no problem, gas rationing, no problem. It's patriotism, and we'll follow government.
Well, Richard, let me just interrupt you there just on the government bit before we go through other parts of the survey. So it's not as if governments have covered themselves with glory in this situation. And yet you're seeing a rise in government trust bigger than the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, bigger in the US than 9/11. How do you explain that?
Well, I think that government is the most trusted to find the cure for the pandemic, most trusted as an information source, most trusted in terms of dictating how we're going to interact with each other, social distancing, et cetera. Most trusted in terms of coping with the psychological aspect of the crisis, to be locked down. So, it's unexpected, Fred, but in a certain way, it's a little bit like the Titanic has hit an iceberg, and there's a lifeboat, and the lifeboat looks great relative to the water. And now we have to row to the shore. This is another exercise.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because in your report, And I would commend everybody to look at this report, and we'll also run URLs so you can get access to it. But in the report, you talk about how when there's been big jumps, double-digit jumps in trust in the past, that they're not lasting. Do you think this one is going to be more lasting? What would make this a more fundamental shift?
I think we're in a trust bubble, Fred. I think that, in fact, by next year's Davos, if we have so, in fact, we'll see a serious decline from this peak, and could be by 15, 20 points down, because there's going to be perhaps another outbreak. There's going to be the blame game when we go back to work, of who said to go back too quickly and whose fault is it. And so ultimately, I think government is right now seen as fast, relatively, getting us to act, decisive, and most of anything, Fred, it has dominated the communication, the daily nature of President Trump, Anthony Fauci, Dr. Birx, Andrew Cuomo, others. The face forward on all of this is government. Here's a stat that you'll like. There have been 400 op-eds in the Washington Post, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal in the last 4 weeks. 2 have been CEOs. 398 have not. Every other face is academics or government.
That's amazing. And we'll come back to the CEO issue, because of course that's one of the things you've watched most closely over time. But just sticking with governments for a moment, talk to me in the international field. What you've seen is interesting. I found it interesting that Japan seemed to be something of an outlier. I found it interesting that even though the Chinese seem to trust their government, in another part of the survey, they don't seem to trust the information that's in the media, which is government information. So if you're looking at the survey in terms of differences in countries, and particularly the Japan question and the China question, what are you learning among these 11 countries that really sets them apart?
So for Japan, this is the worst showing since Fukushima. And in fact, the Japanese stalled on implementing any sort of lockdown because they wanted to preserve the option of keeping the Olympics. And they make excuses like our Constitution doesn't allow lockdowns, all this stuff. That's not the fact. The fact is they wanted the games. They wanted the money. They wanted the reputation opportunity. They wanted to show that they were the clean country. And now people are angry at the government. And so, but it's not just the government in Japan. Every institution is quite low. The China numbers are actually quite stunning. The extent to which the Chinese now rely on social media instead of government-owned media is staggering. It is contrary to the rest of the world, where there's been a marked increase in trust in mainstream media. In fact, your alma mater, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and others, have record subscription numbers, and a incredible rise. I think the New York Times had 250 million uniques or something like this in the last month. We want quality information, but in China, quality information might come from social media, in which case
there was a Trump bump for U.S. media, but now there's a COVID bump.
Absolutely, it's a second bump for media. But media still has the issue, Fred, of being seen as politicized, of being seen as somehow chasing clicks. It's incredible in the United States the differences between Republicans and Democrats. So for Republicans, media is trusted 35%. For Democrats, almost 70%. Versus federal government, the Democrats don't trust federal government, and Republicans had a huge jump in trust in federal government in this last 4 months. And for the state and local, the big gap is filled by state and local for Democrats.
Yeah, I found that perhaps predictable, but still a little bit troubling. So let's stick with analysis of what that means if you're going forward in a 2020 election, if you're still in a COVID situation. Uh, does this really paint the picture of a quite divided United States and how it's going to process the whole COVID period? So, in other words, a crisis will usually bring us closer together. And you certainly see a lot of coming together of normal human beings during this period of time, helping each other out, but it doesn't seem to be happening politically.
Idea somehow of marches on Michigan and Texas saying, open us up, we're small business, we're going broke, leave us alone. There's a kind of, you know, Western, like open up to the West, we're the free spirits. I mean, you grew up in Utah, you know what I'm talking about. You went to Idaho with me. I mean, there's a, we're special and we can fight through anything. It's not exactly so.
Yeah.
And actually, our data is very important on this. By 3 to 1, people said, CEOs, pay attention. Do not open up too early. Do not allow us to be exposed. They get the point of this is causing us a business problem, but they really think that the mandate is solve the health crisis and then we can go back to work. So, to your point, Fred, we do have a deeply divided country. It's Alice in Wonderland. You look through the telescope 2 different ways.
Yeah, I think there's so much interesting material in this that one won't get through all of it. But let's stick with governments for one just a second, or differences between countries. Talk to me a little bit more about the China trust on social media. How big of a gap is there? And is that just trusting somebody more, as you've shown in this, someone you know? So the social media is the answer to the distrust in say government-controlled media, or how do you read this? And then separately, second question, is there anything else in national differences worth touching on before we move on to business?
So I'll get to China in a minute. The rebound in trust in government in the UK is stunning, 25 points. The extent of distrust in France is a legacy of Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, and more reliance on local government in France than any other place except for the United States. And Mrs. Merkel's had a big rebound, big rebound. She's the hero in a sense of Europe, having recognized it early, locked people down, been effective, and said, look, I'm a scientist. I get this. We're not taking any chances. That's that.
Her uncharacteristic speech to the nation on television happens in a lot of countries all the time, but she had really never done it before, and it was really moving. It was really touching. Very different Angela Merkel.
Yeah. Now, in Asia, the success of the Korean lockdown has given a big boost to that government. I know you had the president as a guest of honor in New York 2 years ago or 18 months ago, and he's come great. And so, meanwhile, in China, the phenomenon of distrust, I think trust has become local in a certain way in China. In addition to trusting the government, you also want to check it out with what you see with your friends and family. And so, and by the way, that move of trust local is manifested in other ways in other parts of the world. It's actually through my employer. My employer, it turns out, is the most trusted institution in much of the world. Not so much in China, but certainly in the US and elsewhere. Big responsibilities for CEOs to speak up to their people.
Well, let's go there to the responsibilities of CEOs to speak to their people, which we've seen in your trust barometer over years, that more and more CEOs are trusted individuals to turn to. My employer, more trusted individuals. What's interesting in this survey is that even though you see the numbers going up across all the institutions you look at, media, NGOs, government, business, the business has been the smaller jump. And you actually talk about some real warning signs in this survey for CEOs. Could you talk about those?
Sure. So I think CEOs have actually willingly put their heads down in the last 3 months. They have felt that it's inappropriate for them to be visible. It's inappropriate for their brands to be alongside COVID kind of news. And at the same time, they have actually deferred to government. It's like a bike race, Fred. When you and I are out biking and it's windy, and I let you run in front and you break the wind for me, and I'm able to draft on you. At some point, I think it's right now, business is going to have to come out and ride alongside, at least, if not in front, because it's actually, here's a statistic: trust in CEOs is only 29%. It's down substantially in the last 4 months. As to who's doing a good job in this pandemic, 29% is the ranking given CEOs. It's lower than journalists, lower than NGO heads, substantially lower than academics and scientists. So it's a failing grade for CEOs because they've disappeared. They've done a very good job, it seems to me, of taking care of their businesses, applying for PPP or whatever else. But absence does not make the heart grow fonder. And so now is the time for public leadership. CEOs have to explain how business is going to be done in the next period, because we don't really understand in a restaurant. So how are you going to keep me safe? Are you going to have half the number of people in the restaurant? Are you going to have temperature checks to be able to go to a hotel? You and I are very frequent travelers. Am I going to have to wear a mask on an airplane? Just tell me what I have to do and then let me make the judgment. But if you don't tell me what the future is going to look like, I have to either guess or go to social media and get kind of a lot of disinformation. And so, we really have to now push CEOs out there and explain that they and their brands have to make sure that people get it, and whatever the getting it is. So, for example, we do work for Starbucks, and they are reopening. They're going to have very few people allowed to be in the stores, 6 foot between customers to get the coffee, and PPE for the employees. And so they have a concept. I get it. Just tell me what I'm supposed to do. Kevin Johnson of Starbucks done that really well. More need to follow his example. Also, Alan Jobe, Unilever, has done it really well to explain we're going to help our supply chain. All the small businesses, we're going to give them longer credit terms. We're also going to keep people working at Unilever and our suppliers. We're going to pay them through June, then we'll have to reevaluate. That's clear. I get it. So the rest now have to follow suit.
What I don't entirely understand in this, and maybe you can drill down on this a little bit further, is at the Atlantic Council, we're feeling it. So we have a smaller team than, say, at IBM or Microsoft. But we're doing a town hall at the end of the week, every week at 3 p.m. We used to do just one a month, Monday mornings. And the team has really liked it. But what they're demanding of me as CEO is more transparency. More transparency in what we're doing to deal with the health crisis, what we're doing to keep them safe, but also what we're doing in terms of running the business. And how do the numbers look? And are people going to lose their jobs or that sort of thing? Clearly, it's a different situation if you're United Airlines and your resources are shot right now, or whether you're leading Amazon and you're hiring 175,000 new people. So what advice do you give to individual CEOs in those sorts of situations? One where you're in a crisis situation, another where you're actually in a growth situation out of this crisis. I would imagine it's a quite different picture depending on what kind of CEO you are. And maintaining trust while you have to let people go is probably the hardest thing of all.
So, Fred, trust for corporations is premised on 2 factors. On the x-axis is competence, on the y-axis is integrity. And what's happened in this last period is that business competence has been challenged. So do we have the right products? Are we giving people the right prices? Are we protecting our employees, meat industry, for example? And are we sketching out the future? All of that's in the competence bucket. On the integrity side, it is, are we somehow putting people ahead of profits? Are we long-term capitalists? Are we making sure that our employees are getting reskilled, that we're keeping them working? The softer side. And so business has, according to our data, done just mediocre job in those areas. Whereas only 4 months ago, business was seen as deeply competent and improving on integrity. Things like the LA Lakers or Richard Branson applying for government bailouts doesn't exactly help. It smacks of 2008 when we had, misapplication in the financial crisis. But the bigger point here that you're making is frequency matters. More details than you are used to, and please talk to the employees first, because unfortunately there's still too much of we talk to Wall Street and the employees will get around to it. No, it is an inside out world. Employees first, customers second, communities third. And we promised all that in August at the Business Roundtable. 189 CEOs signed that declaration, with Jamie Dimon and Alex Gorski leading the way about stakeholder capitalism. Well, now's the test. This is the crucible. It's the moment of reckoning for business. And we have to come good on this. It's really important. Even if we're not succeeding, we have to explain what's the plan, how we're going to come back. Even if it takes us 10 years, we're going to do the best we can. Here's the story.
That's just a terrific answer. If you look at some of these numbers in your report, several areas of deep concern. CEOs right now, for many of the reasons you're listing, rank last among leaders in how well they performed during COVID-19. Only 44% believe companies are protecting their employees sufficiently. Under half think business is doing a good job developing solutions. 50%, only 50%, and this gets to your point about putting employees first, are putting people before profits. And I think this is really the point, is putting employees first at this time, because it's and the fact that you're calling this a crucible and the real test right now to the whole corporate social responsibility trend. I think all of that's hugely important. But let me put it in context of something else that's in your report that I think is really interesting. And that is the whole area of fear of job loss, and also concerns people express in terms of the gap between rich and the working class. But perhaps first, the fear of job loss. It was pretty high back in Davos when people were worried about digitalization and new economy and how their jobs could be lost to that. But now you see, if I remember, it's way over 50% of people fearing a job loss from COVID-19.
So, Fred, I think that mass class divide that we started seeing in the US, France, and the UK in 2015, leading to Trump, Brexit, Macron, has metastasized into Germany, into Italy, but also interestingly into Saudi Arabia, into India, et cetera. So the mass class divide, though, now with this pandemic has actually shown the lower stratum, hey, I'm the frontline worker. I'm the person who is most exposed. And wait, 50% of Hispanics in the US have either lost their jobs or had their hours reduced. And we're the ones dying at the highest rate. If you're African American, 5-1 in Chicago death rate. So we really, as business, have an obligation to price our products and create products that suit that group. Also, to pay real attention to getting them involved in the supply chain. Young Latina entrepreneurs, get them in somehow, and make sure that we're recognizing the necessity of more equal outcomes. 2008 recovery was a bad sign to people. They don't want that again. If government's putting money in, they want a more equal distribution of the returns at the other end.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me. And in the survey, do you get the feeling that people think that these job losses are permanent, partial? One of the things I'm watching, and we're watching very closely, is the different approach of Europe to the United States. Where United States, you really the subsidy is for the employer to create jobs, but a lot of jobs are being lost. While the lean in Europe is more toward keeping people on the payroll, even if it's some sort of supported or reduced pay. Do you see any differences in attitudes of quote unquote the mass population that you look at between Europe and the United States?
Well, the fear of job loss is more profound in markets where you don't have so much support. And you know, and it's playing out in the economies. I mean, I think European joblessness is about half X of the US at the moment. Um, Now,
Yeah.
some of that is because actually it's against the law to make anybody redundant in Italy and Spain until May 15th. Let's see what happens after that. But in the long run, we're going to all have to recognize that big government has to be paid for one way or another, and either through rights or through taxes. And that's when we start to get the blame game. But this point of going back to work, Fred, I can't really say strongly enough how important it is for CEOs to wait for health authorities and let them dictate the conditions of the field, and then we can implement. But we cannot be seen as pushing. We have to be seen as accepting and ready for it and outlining the conditions.
Yeah, I thought one of the more interesting parts of advice that you're giving CEOs is to be seen and to talk alongside of public health officials and scientists, and to a certain extent burnishing your own image next to the people that
I mean,
people.
that, David, Fred, that's what I do at Edelman. Every week we do a call. Yeah.
Toward the end of this CEO conversation, Richard, I'd love to have you talk in larger terms, because I know you think about this, of the role of government going forward. So there is this needle of trust. There's some concern about the future of capitalism. Then there was confidence in capitalism. Now, of course, government has stepped in. It's really going to be an interesting question to see how long government steps in. Where do you see attitudes in general are in what you're measuring versus a more free market capitalist society, and one that has more government and more government intervention in it?
So, Fred, even before this COVID, in January, we pointed out that half the people, as of January, were expressing real concerns about capitalism. That more than half said the system doesn't work, it's rigged. And so here we have a moment in time where government is providing massive amounts of funding, $55 billion to the airlines. And our Secretary of the Treasury, even who's in a conservative administration, says, the government should have an equity stake in the airlines, which was not the Obama policy vis-a-vis the banks. So if the point becomes preservation of jobs, then actually government may be a better way of doing that, because the private sector will say, sorry, it's not efficient. The government may have a different approach. That's always been the French government way, keep people working, group bull and all those things. I'm not saying it's the right way, but are we at a point of tip where it's 40 years of Reagan, Thatcher, et cetera, free markets, and are free markets actually working?
And as a final question, because I love to end this on an optimistic note, your survey, surprisingly, I was relatively surprised by the trust in government. You've explained that, but there is still a fundamental optimism in the future in this survey. Could you talk about that?
By 2 to 1, people actually believe this is going to have a good outcome, that this is going to be a positive for the world, that we're going to somehow take better care of issues like inequality, that we're going to take better care of our families, we're going to eat home more, and that we're going to reevaluate our priorities. And I'd like to think that. And I'd like to believe that good companies will come through this, and there'll be a temporary reaction of job loss and other things, but that we'll fight back. And both of us are optimists. We got lost in our hike in Sun Valley, and we knew we were going to get out. And that's sort of the way I look at this problem.
Well, I think that lost in the hike story will have to wait to a different episode. But I think the indomitability of the human spirit is what you're talking about. And this 2-to-1 optimism is, I hope, what we'll be able to tap going forward. Richard, this has just been a great conversation. Thanks for this incredibly valuable survey. And I hope that we can get you back when we have updated installments.
Thank you, Fred, very much.
All right. Thank you.